Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And thank you for subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am your boy, 12 Kyle. Check this out. The other day, I was sitting around and I was listening to some old school hip hop. And I was listening to this album from Ice Cube, Kill It Will. And then the ending came on where he gave shout outs. And it made me think like, I really need to shout out all of the contributors to this podcast. Um, as many of you know, or maybe you don't know, this podcast is coming up on 500 episodes. And that's not a small task in and of itself. So, in the spirit of Ice Cube, I said, you know what? I'm going to dedicate this one to everybody who contributed to this podcast. All of my guest hosts, you're going to get shouted out right here, right now. So let's get it cracking. Man, first up, I got to say what up to everybody who listens. First and foremost, because without you, there is no podcast. Man, this podcast got started November of 2017. I mean, it's bugged out that it's been that long. As many of you know, maybe you don't know, I started off with an internet radio show called the 12 Radio Show, and then I flipped it into this podcast. But no, the official start date, if you will, of the podcast was November 19th, 2015. And I'm happy about that, man. And like I said, we're coming up on 500 episodes. But I got to shout out everybody who contributed to this podcast. Now, my first 12 episodes were old episodes from the 12 Radio Show that I loaded into the podcast because I wanted to have those, for keepsake, because they're really, really dope episodes. So I got to shout out the contributors to the old 12 Radio Show that made it to the 12 Kyle podcast. Shout out Big Larry. Big Larry, my teammate from South Carolina State. He appeared on the first episode that appears on this podcast, Behind Closed Doors. Big Larry. Shout out to Erica. They killed that episode. That episode was about sex, and I mean, like, it is by far one of the funniest episodes that I've ever been a part of, even myself or co-hosting with someone else. Hilarious episode. Gotta shout out Q the Six Man. Q the Six Man has appeared on this podcast 4 times. I remember when Q linked up with us at Dead End Sports, and I remember when we thought Q was a robot. And Q is like, I think Q might be 25, 26 right now. Young cat, but I mean, wise beyond his age. And it was good to have Q on, man. Shout out to Q. Gotta shout out my homegirl, Krishna. She made it to the 12 Radio Show and the 12 Kyle podcast. She was on 2 episodes. Shout out to the homie Vince from the Soul Survivors crew. Shout out to Vince. Vince came through for an episode, man. It was really, really dope. I would be remiss if I didn't shout out the other rest of the Soul Survivors crew because they came through for an episode as well. That would be Aisha, El Marie, and Samantha. All of them contributed to the podcast. So I was really, again, happy and excited that they came through for your boy. And we had a good time. Trust me, we had a good time. My next contributor was on the 12 Radio Show as well. Hip hop head extraordinaire, Rashawn Jamal. Man, it's always good to have Rashawn on. Rashawn, funny brother. He's got stories. And if you've been following the podcast, you know about the stories he has. But I think my last guest from the 12 radio show that actually made it to this podcast form was my man Mo, number 27. That's my guy. We've been rolling since we played ball together at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, South Carolina, in the 90s. And Mo popped in on 2 episodes, man, and we had a ball. We had a ball. Mo's one of my best friends. He's my oldest son's godfather, and that's my right hand man. So it was good. It was good having Mo on the podcast. My first guest, official guest on the 12 Kyle podcast, was no stranger to the show. Real dope friend of mine, my man BZ430 from Dead End Hip Hop and Dead End Sports. B came through, man. We broke down I want to say it was the Roots album, Philadelphia Half-Life. And it's funny, man, because B is a real laid-back cat, Detroit cat, kind of quiet. Man, I might have said 2 words on that episode. B just went in. Let's see who else gets a shout out. Oh, shout out to Shantae. Shantae appeared on 3 episodes. Me and Shantae go way back. H-Town representative. We go back to the days of Blogger. And she came through. I remember one episode, probably one of the best episodes we did of the 3 was Black Motherhood. That was a really dope episode. So I got to shout out Shantae. Next up, another fellow blogger, my homegirl Nadia. She came through on a relationship tip. Shout out to Nadia. Next up, another blogger. I gotta shout out the homie Rich from St. Louis. Rich came through. We did an episode together, man. We promoted his clothing line. That was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun, man. And that was a pretty popular episode too, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, I cannot forget probably the biggest contributor to the 12 radio show. But she was right here on the 12 Kyle podcast. My homegirl, you know her, you love her, Shelly Shell. Shell was on 3 episodes here. And anytime Shell gets on, it's a good time. It's a bunch of laughs, it's a bunch of cutting up because that's how Shell gets down. So shout out to her. Shout out to Juwana. Juwana came through for an episode. And that was really dope because she came through with my homegirl Tiffany, somebody else who I met through Blogger. And I remember I hit Tiffany up. I was like, I sent her the notes as far as what I wanted to talk about on the podcast. And I think that particular episode was Are We Socially Inept? And I remember we did that around the beginning of the year. And Juwana was dope, man. She was really dope. She had never done a podcast before. And she came through and blazed it. So shout out to her. Shout out to Tiffany, who appeared on 2 episodes as well. Again, another former blogger. I used to blog back in the day, in case you didn't know. Shout out to my homegirl from the 215. Shout out to Janae. Janae came through for the D'Angelo episode. Man, Janae, one of the things I remember about Janae was like, all right, now we gotta get this in because I go to bed at 9 o'clock. I don't think Janae goes to bed at 9 o'clock anymore, but yeah, Janae came through, man. Great knowledge, huge fan. Janae did 3 episodes, I think. I think she did the 2 D'Angelo episodes, and I think she did a Kendrick Lamar episode, if I'm not mistaken. Janae probably could correct me on that. Next up, big shout out. She came through. She came through with Shantae, my homegirl Chris Renee from St. Louis. Again, me and Chris Renee go back to like 2007 from blogging. One of the dopest writers that you will ever read. So shout out to Chris Renee. Next up, my man Keon. He came through for an episode, man. Shout out to Keon. I don't think Keon had been on a podcast before either, so it was dope having him on, man, and picking his brain about some things. Shout out to my boy, my homeboy, Ty from the Tactless Know-It-Alls podcast. He came through and blazed an episode, man, and we had a ball. He's one of the few podcasters that I've not only met in real life, but I went to his house. And he lives in Atlanta. Shout out to his wife, Mia, and we've hung out a couple of times. Good people, really good people. They're no longer podcasting, but good people nonetheless, man. And check out that. I mean, I think the podcast is still up. Tactless Know-It-Alls. I mean, you can get a lot of information from them. I would be remiss if I didn't shout out these two dudes. First up, the poet laureate D Love Hall's in the building. D Love Hall, Derek, my boy, you guys, if you've been following this podcast, you know Derek was on, let me see, D was on 10 episodes. And we go back. I mean, he's crew. He's crew from back home crew. So any episode that he's been on has been dope. I think probably one of my most memorable episodes with him was it was called like Things They Don't Tell You About Sex or something like that. And I mean, his perspective was wow. It was, go back to the archives and check that out. And then the other homie from the crew, my man Easy Does It VA, aka my boy Zell. Zell came through for 7 episodes. One of the funniest moments in this podcast history was the story that Zell told about playing up against. Zell went to Hampton in undergrad, and so when he was at Hampton, there was a point guard. Zell played basketball. There was a point guard in the Tidewater area that used to come and hang out on their campus, but he was in high school. Little dude. You may have heard of him. Allen Iverson. And Zell tells this story about him playing against AI, and AI made the ball disappear. Listen, that story will never, it's legendary in our crew, but to hear him tell it on the podcast was crazy. Like I said, Zell came through for 3 episodes. Next up, man, family. At least I consider them to be family. From the We Did That Shit podcast, Babi Amina. Babi, man, she appeared on 4 episodes, and you guys know I love their podcast. We Did That Shit podcast. I need them to come back. I need them to come back to this podcast, and I need them to come back to their podcast. But you know, Babi and Maya be all over the country and all over the world, so I don't know if they got time for podcasting, but they're gonna have time for this podcast because they're gonna be back on. And I mentioned Maya. Maya was on 6 episodes. Maya and I did an episode. We did 2 episodes at the conclusion of the TV series Insecure. Man, listen, Maya went in. We had 1 episode just about Condola, and it might have been a 13-minute episode, but it was hilarious. So shout out to Babi and Maya. Shout out to the We Did That Shit podcast. Y'all need to come back. And again, I'm going to have you back on here, but I need y'all to bring the podcast right back. Next up, man, a guy I met on Twitter, man, been rocking with this dude for a minute. My man, Matt B. Matt B, he came through he's been on 7 episodes. Seems like it's been more than that, man, but a hip hop head. Matt and I always chopping it up online. And, you know, Matt still thinks that Outkast's best album was ATLiens. It wasn't. It's Aquemini. But yeah, shout out to Matt, man. Next up, I got to give a shout out, huge shout out to one of the wealthiest podcasters in the world. I feel privileged enough that the man has brought me on his podcast, and also he's come on this podcast. I'm talking about none other than the one and only King Germ. King Germ from the Pod and Saved Our Marriage podcast. Germ has been on this podcast 9 times. Seems like it's been more than that, but he's been on 9 times, man. I think the first episode he came on, if you know Germ, he indulges in, you know, smoking reefer. And that's what the episode was about. Like, as somebody who's never smoked weed before, I just fired off questions to Germ, and it was funny. It was a funny podcast. We did an episode about Jordan. Air Jordans, and many other episodes, man. But big fan. That's my guy right there. Me and Germ, we'll chop it. We'll call each other a text every other day. So yeah, shout out to Germ. Next up, got a shout out another fellow podcaster, my man Cole Jackson. Cole Jackson came through and we talked about I think it was Yo MTV Raps. And that was a dope episode, man. And I've been on his podcast along with Rain Coleman. And I got to get them on. I got to get both of them on here. And that's another thing, too, is I was writing down some of the names of the people who I've done episodes with. I'm like, wait a minute. I thought we did. No, we didn't do an episode. Oh, maybe we did do an episode. And then, like, you just don't really think about it. But, yeah, big shout out to Cole Jackson. Next up, got to give a shout out to Miss Wilson. Miss Wilson, a relatively new podcaster. She came through and we did an episode, and she's supposed to come back on, but she's been dragging her heels. But I know when she watches this, she's going to know that I'm calling her out and that she needs to come back. But yeah, shout out to her and her podcast, the Wine 30 podcast. Let's see who else. Can't forget my man, a real true hip hop head, my boy B Cox from the Vault Classic Music Hip Hop Podcast. Nothing but the vaults, nothing but the classics. That's what he does on his episodes. And B Cox has been on 3 or 4 episodes. I think it's 4. I think he's been on 4 episodes, but nonetheless, HBCU alum, just overall great guy, man. Congrats again on the marriage. Congrats again on the little man. Welcoming into the family, man. Definitely got to get B Cox back on here soon as well. I would be remiss if I did not forget about ATP, better known as Autumn the Plug. And she's not Autumn the Plug, but she's really Autumn the Aries, but I call her Autumn the Plug because Autumn is the person who really connected me with a bunch of other podcasters, some of which whom I'm going to speak of. But like when you look at like the tree of how we all met, it's all been through like, Autumn. And it's wild when I think about it because like, she's been the connector. Autumn's been on 2 episodes. I feel like it's been more, but I've been on Autumn's podcast as well. So I think that's probably why it feels like it's been a lot. Gotta go back for my next shout out, gotta go back to my hometown, Florence, South Carolina, my high school teammate, my man Hassan. He came through and man, we talked about clothing and styles. So shout out to him. We had a really good time on that episode. Another fellow podcaster gets a big shout out. One of the best DJs, probably the best DJ in Duval County. None other than my man Al Pete. Shout out to Al Pete, man. Al Pete came through, man, and we had a great. I mean, Al Pete was one of those when he came on. I actually got a chance to interview him, talk to him as a DJ, and what was going on in Jacksonville at the time, and just kind of pick his brain, man. So check out his podcast and his network. Al Pete, you can't go wrong. Next up, one member of the podcast Happy Hour crew. That would be none other than Jay Boog from the Jay's Quick 3 podcast. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to. I met Jay through Autumn. So again, Autumn the Plug. I'm telling you, Autumn plugs everybody together. But Jay's been on 4 episodes, I think 3 or 4 episodes. But Jay, I mean, you don't know this, but Jay is like the 4th member of TLC. But yeah, it was it was good, always good having Jay on. So the shout outs don't stop now. Don't think the shout outs stop. I gotta shout out my man Dwayne, aka DJ CK1. That's my guy, man. He came through for the HBCU episode. Now that HBCU episode, the episode was called "Why HBCUs Matter," and I had 10 different people from 10 different HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. And Dwayne came through representing for North Carolina Central. Jay Boog came through representing for Prairie View A&M University. Excuse me, is it Prairie View A&M? Prairie View. I think it's Prairie View A&M. I think. Jay Boog gonna kill me. Shout out to Tiff J. Tiff J came through on that particular episode, representing North Carolina A&T. And my homegirl Sherry, she came through representing Spelman. So shout out to her, and big shout out to Ursula, my homegirl, who came through on that particular episode as well, representing those Rattlers from Florida A&M University. Big shout out to the Sports Life Podcast. My man KT, the coach, and B Jones, the mouth of the South. Man, it was good being on their podcast, and I got a chance to get them on this podcast. And his brothers out of Texas, man, they do it big. They do it really, really big. So it was great having them on. Let's see. My next shout out goes to a young fella, and I call him a young fella. He's from the north side of the Chi, my man, Northside Doug. Northside Doug and I, Doug's been on 3 episodes. Probably one of my favorite episodes that he was on was he and I came up with a list of our top 20 favorite producers of all time. I think I came up with a great 20. I think he came up with a great 20. His number 1 did surprise me. But if you're from Chicago, you shouldn't be surprised because Doug is from Chicago. But yeah, it was dope having Doug on, and that's my guy. I give him the business. I always, mess with him, but Doug's good people. Next up, one of my best friends in the Marvel universe, Dr. Jamel came through. She came through during COVID, like at the height of COVID, and that was dope. And I got to get her back on. She a little too busy for me now, but she got to come back on here and talk about her stuff. Next up after that, I got to give a big shout out to my homegirl Trish. Trish has been on 4 episodes. Trish and I go way back. Trish is funny, and we've got a couple of episodes coming. We haven't recorded them yet, but they're smokers. I'll just put it like that. Big shout out to the homie Vernell. Vernell came through, man. We talked hip hop. We talked Ice Cube. What was it? Kill It? No, it wasn't Kill It Will. It was I can't remember which Ice Cube album it was, but yeah, it was good having Vernell on. He represents New Orleans to the fullest. Shout out to Vernell. Next up, man, big shout out to my brother. I call him my brother because he is from the east side of Los Angeles. My man BTG, Baylor the Great. He's got 2 podcasts, Open Run with BTG and BTG for President. My man Baylor has come through for 4 episodes. One of the things I can say about Baylor, man, I mean, I met Baylor in real life, and it ain't a bunch of podcasts that I met in real life, but this dude, man, I came to LA, and I always tell this story about how I don't know where Baylor was. He had just got off work, and I was like, yo, he's like, well, yo, where you at? I was like, we're at LA Live, about to go into the Laker game, because I had tickets to the Laker game. Me and my family, we were going to see LeBron play Sacramento Kings, and I was out there. This was what, 2021? 2021, Thanksgiving 2021. And I don't know where Baylor was. I don't know where he worked. I know wherever he worked or lived wasn't nowhere near where I was in downtown LA. I'm literally about to go in the Staples Center. But he came through, man, and we chopped it. He pulled up on me, man. We chopped it up for about 20 minutes before we went inside the stadium. We flicked it up, and it was cool, man. And I mean, that's my brother. So when I come back to LA, the first place I'm going is I'm going to kick with Baylor. And we chop it up every day. I mean, like really one of those. He's one of those people's man. One of those people where from podcasting a friendship is built. You know what I'm saying? And I don't take that lightly. So yeah, shout out to BTG. Shout out to Coach Tony Madlock. He came in as a guest at the time that he came on the podcast. Tony Madlock was the head basketball coach at South Carolina State University, my alma mater. See it right there. See my jersey right there, back over there. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. You see my helmet right here too. Yeah, at the time, Coach was the head basketball coach at South Carolina State University. He has moved on and is now the head basketball coach, I want to say, at Alabama State. Yeah, he's at Alabama State. Good luck, Coach. Great. It was great having him on my podcast. Big shout out to my man Jay Emanuel. Jay Emanuel came through and we talked about the high school years. Fellow podcaster. Man, Jay, I've seen Jay grow up in this podcast game and just all of his endeavors and everything, man. Great guy. Check him out. And I definitely have to get him back on here as well. Can't forget about my boy Manny Fresh. From Dead End Sports. And Manny's got like 7 other podcasts that he's on. Manny came through and talked about Biggie. I think that was the episode if Biggie were still alive. So yeah, shout out to Manny for coming through. And I got to shout out another member of the podcast Happy Hour crew, Tamra. Tamra to the break of dawn. Tamra came through and we talked about dating. It's fun just having Tamra on because I'm such a fan of her and her podcast. So that was dope. And again, I met Tamra through Autumn the Plug. And I want to say I met Baylor inadvertently through Autumn the Plug. I mean, she's the plug, man. That's what she does. Next guest, man. I said that Baylor was going to be the first person that I saw when I go back to LA. The second person I'm gonna see, Uncle Dolomite from the Too Much Game podcast. That's my dude right there. I mean, he's one of the wealthiest people in the state of California. Period. Don't get that twisted. But besides his enormous wealth, good dude, man, a real one through and through. I mean, that's my guy, man. And I linked up with him through King Germ, and we've been kicking it ever since, man. Dolly's been on 3 episodes, and trust me, we got some more coming. Next big shout out to Dr. and I never call him Dr. Thomas Stallworth. I don't even call him Thomas. I don't think I've ever called him Thomas. One of my good best friends, Dr. Thomas Stallworth, came through. He is currently, at the time of this recording, the head strength coach for the Atlanta Falcons in the NFL. Stall and I go back 20 years, and he came on and we just talked about football and everything, and it was great having him on. Next shout out I got to give, man, is somebody I think really should have her own podcast because she is just that dope. I'm talking about none other than Britt Renee, my girl Britt. She did 3 episodes with me, and I linked up with her through Baylor. Man, Britt is dope. She is really, really dope. She knows her music. We did a relationship episode, and I got more planned with Britt as well. Got to give a big shout out to Big Smash. I mean, fellow podcaster, the guy's crazy. I didn't know what he was going to say on the podcast, but he kept it pretty PC. I think King Germ threatened him, but that's beside the point. Yeah, shout out to Big Smash, who came through and blessed the podcast. Big shout out to the homeboy from the 843, my man Danny Foxworth. Danny Foxworth has not 1 but 2 podcasts. Man, I like, and if I'm not mistaken, Danny Foxworth probably just started both podcasts earlier this calendar year. And when I tell you this dude is out of here, he is out of here. He studied, the greats like Combat Jack. I love listening to Danny's podcast, both of them, and we definitely gonna do some more as well. I just recently had him on, and we talked about the Black on Both Sides album, and that was one of the most popular. I mean, not that I get into numbers, but it's one of the most popular podcasts that I did this year. Cannot forget about my homie, family, my boy LaTroy Johnson, currently I think he's the associate athletic director of football at Florida A&M University. Shout out to FAMU. Shout out to my boy Troy. Troy came through earlier this summer, and we talked football, man. And God willing, FAMU may be playing for some big chips here later on this season. So we'll see. We'll keep our eyes on them. Next up, a cat that I met through King Germ and Uncle Dolomite, Rodis from the Rodis Live podcast. Man, listen, one of the coolest, one of the realest to come out of the city of Chicago, man. Big shout out to Rodis. Had him on, and definitely going to have him on again. Last but not least, well, no, not last but not least, but for this segment, last but not least, got to give a big shout out to my man Lamp. Conversations with Lamp. It's funny because I'd heard King Germ talk about Lamp a lot, and I remember him telling me like, "Yo, you got to go on this. You got to go on Lamp's podcast." And I go on Lamp's podcast, and he literally asked me a question, and I don't think I've ever been asked that question before, but when I go back and listen to how I answered the question, he was able to pull out more in me than I thought that I gave for the question. And I joke with Lamp all the time. I told Lamp, I said, man, I'm gonna start calling you CNN Lamp, because like he asks questions like he works for CNN, like he's doing a documentary on you or something. But yeah, shout out to Lamp, man. It was good having him on as well. Everybody that I've mentioned that I've given shout outs, I plan to have them back on. It's very few people I think that can come on this podcast once and just be it. There's been some who've only been on here once, but I'm still super cool with everybody, still fly with everybody. There's nobody that I cut off or nobody cut me off. So we can definitely do it again, and we will for almost everybody, really, to be honest. Last but not least, well, actually, not last. Next to last but not least, Eclectic. Man, what can I say, man? This dude is definitely the wealthiest podcaster in the world. Eclectic and I go back. We go back to the blogger days. So I was interested as I did a tally. As you heard, I've been telling you how many episodes these people have been on. In my head, I told myself, I was like, Eclectic has probably been on this podcast 50 times. Probably 50 times. I was close. Eclectic has been on this podcast 48 times. Now, that don't include the 48 times, that's just for this podcast. It doesn't include the time that I spent on his podcast, both the Encyclopedia Hip Hop podcast and the Eclectic Discussion podcast. And then he was a frequent contributor to the 12 radio show, excuse me. All in all, we've probably done, I don't know, probably about 150 episodes. We've probably done about 150 episodes if I'm keeping it a bean. Yeah, so shout out to E. That's my man. I will say this, just on a personal note. If you ever get a chance, go to the bar with him. And that's all I'm going to say. He did some things at the bar that I've never seen before. I mean, like, I've never seen anybody tell the bartender, hey, just make something. Just make something. I'll drink it. Shout out to E. And definitely last but not least, I got to thank my sons, Dion, Cameron, and Brandon. Dion and Brandon appeared on one episode. Cameron has been on 3 episodes. I don't know why Cameron got on more than them, but that episode that the 4 of us did together was really, really dope. One of my favorite episodes. We were talking sports and talking trash like we always do. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. I mean, and for some reason, I really can't even explain why, but my daughter Skylar has not been on the podcast. She's the only one that hasn't been on the podcast that needs to be on the podcast. So at some point, I got to bring my heart on the podcast. So she's gonna come on here. She's only 12, but she got a lot to say. Trust me, you 12-year-olds can talk. And last but not least, my wife Sharice. She was on the podcast 3 separate times. And we had a good time each time. And I think, having her on the podcast gives people, particularly those people who don't know us and they just know her through pictures, a glimpse as to who we are and what we're about or whatever the case may be. But yeah, that's it, man. And again, I said it at the beginning, but I got to say it again and say it again. Thank you to those of you listening. Shout out to you, because if it had not been for you, maybe this episode, maybe the podcast stops at 2. I don't know. I mean, like, I don't worry about how many people listen because I really don't have any control over it. What I have control over is my ability to put out the content and just let it be what it is from there. But I'm definitely appreciative. I don't think you get to 500 episodes, and we're coming up on 500 episodes. I don't think you get that close without people really rocking with you and understanding how you get down and buying into you. People come to hear me talk. And I've always said, like, every episode isn't meant to be listened to by 1,000 people, but y'all keep coming back, and I appreciate that. And but I had to take time, man, to shout out everybody who contributed to this podcast. I don't think I forgot anybody. I think I got all the names in. I think I got all the right episodes in. If for some reason you were on this podcast and I forgot you, please charge it to my heart. Charge it to my head, not to my heart. If you haven't been on this podcast just yet, trust me, you will get on this podcast and we will have a good time because we got so many more episodes to go. That's going to do it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for checking out this special shout out edition. I gotta say what up edition to the 12 Kyle podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. The podcast drops every Thursday at midnight. From time to time, we drop bonus episodes on Sundays at midnight. If you feel so inclined, hit us up on Cash App, $TWELVEKYLE. Again, that's going to do it for me. Thank you for checking out this edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am your boy 12 Kyle. I'll catch you guys next time. 5 G's. Chill.